This is Charlie Kao with Travel More Media in Durban, South Africa at the Indaba Travel Trade Exhibition with Nigel Nicoll, who's the Chief Executive of African Travel and Tourism Association. Nigel, the first thing I'd like to ask you is to give us an overview over the past few decades of how travel and tourism has evolved in Africa.
Well, I first got involved in travel and tourism with this association back in the early 1990s. And of course the big difference really from those days has been the arrival of the internet, and many of the youngsters were just used to that. But prior to that it was very, very difficult to communicate with our members in Africa. We were a small trade association. And it wasn't until the late 1990s, going over into the millennium, that the industry started taking note of the web and started communicating through the World Wide Web. So that's the difference.
Now, tourism travel to Africa, let's go back even to the 60s. That's for the rich, the carriage trade. So, and when did it evolve into more mass tourism?
Well, to go back to the first part of that question is that the tourism, in Africa revolved around the safari industry, and it was really started in Kenya just after the war, where the Masai Mara in that area was the main safari destination, and it evolved. Most of the safari industry actually evolved from that start in Kenya, and then it started spreading across the boundaries there into Tanzania, and then southern Africa. Zambia and Botswana were also part of that model. South Africa wasn't, and it wasn't until after the change and the new regime came in under Nelson Mandela that the whole new South African tourism came into place. So there's been a gradual change down the continent over that time.
I would also at this time like to introduce Fiona Jeffries, who's a director of African Travel and Tourism Association. Fiona, how long you've been involved with UK tourism, especially through World Travel Market, as and ending your career there as a chief executive CEO fairly recently. How do you view the evolution of tourism and travel to Africa over those years since the first 1986 World Travel Market?
Ever changing. It's such a dynamic market, Charlie. What's been so engaging about what's been happening in Africa is how the nature of the product has changed and evolved. The development of the adventure market, making Africa more accessible as a destination, the opening up of destinations. Many years ago, you didn't hear of Namibia. Namibia is now one of the key tourism destinations if you want a very different experience. People knew about safari experiences in Kenya, but now, to visit Swaziland, Lesotho, Mozambique, Malawi, these were unknown destinations back in the 1970s. So the whole continent has opened up, and what I would say about Africa as a destination compared to any other continent around the world is that it has a different feel. You do get a sense of getting back to the roots of mankind, and therefore it's a much more grassroots, authentic experience, more adventure orientated for many, even if you do want the beautiful beaches, and so it gives a sense of excitement as a traveller, if that's the kind of experience that you're looking for.
Nigel, let's continue on that timeline. So safaris, it spread to some of the countries you mentioned and Fiona mentioned. And what's the next evolution that happened?
What happened really was that the industry then took off in East Africa, and you had two models running. So in Kenya, they went for very high volume, low yield tourism initially, and whereas Tanzania, for example, went for the reverse side. They went for low volume and high yield. So what then happened is, we're getting into the early 2000s, we then got this rush of sort of white minibuses in the Masai Mara all around one tree, and the industry became very aware that this wasn't sustainable. It was really completely wrecking tourism. And the other side of that coin was we went for low volume and high yield, so you made it very expensive. So the markets then sort of started splitting between the expensive ones and the mass tourism. And then, like all things, the tourism really depends on open skies. And unless you have an open skies policy with aviation and you can actually get to the country, you really don't have a destination. And that is something we, as a continent in tourism, are still struggling with. And we've seen the traditional safari experiences in, say, Kenya, Tanzania, coming in through the hub Nairobi, and we've seen down south Johannesburg being the hub for tourism down south. But that has meant that the countries that weren't immediately close to that hub had a huge problem with getting people to their countries. And as we saw airlines like British Airways gradually pulling out of African continent, what they have been doing, they pulled out of Dar es Salaam, they pulled out of Zambia, we suddenly found these countries stranded without any direct links to the UK market. And speaking from my perspective, because I'm based in the UK, and the UK market is traditionally the biggest market to really all of Safari Africa, partly because of our UK's colonial past.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. And what's the second market? US
market, yeah.
Okay.
But a lot of that's to do with the British colonial past, and that is changing. But the way the market's now evolving is the arrival of the new airlines coming in. So, for example, the airlines from the Arab Emirates are now really coming in fast into Africa and opening up new routes all the time. And the second one is the arrival of Ethiopian Airways on the scene. So in Africa now, there are 3 hubs, and they are Addis, Nairobi, and Johannesburg. These are the 3 main hubs. That is now being broken down by people like Ethiopians setting up southern regional hubs. So in order to attract services down to the southern region, they then have a southern regional hub. This will probably be somewhere like Victoria Falls, new airport there. And then you'll be able to get quite easily and not too expensively to countries like Zambia and Malawi. Up to now, the current situation is that from UK, there are no direct flights from UK to any of those markets. So that's a problem. So that's one thing we're working on right now.
Fiona, I'm going to focus on community and what this tourism's effect has been on community and resources. I know you're founder and chairperson of Just a Drop. Can you address the overall issue of community, resources, including water?
One of the reasons I set up Just a Drop was to encourage the travel and tourism industry to give back to communities around the world. And clearly water is one of the most precious resources that we have. None of us realise how valuable it is until we're no longer able to turn on that tap and get water. And one of the hugely valuable things that tourism does, and I think Africa is a fantastic, the operators in Africa are great exemplars of that within travel and tourism, is ensuring that communities do benefit from tourism, both through local employment, but also the investment of tourism that goes into local destinations, either through accommodation services, or your local restaurants or local people growing produce. And it's really important that the supply chain supports that and the travel and tourism industry supports that. And I think tour operators increasingly see that engagement and take responsibility for that. So you have big operators like TUI, for example, who really do look at the entire supply chain throughout. And that's really what one of the huge benefits and values of tourism, which ultimately benefits society, which ultimately also ends up ensuring that there are more people employed and we have a more happier society and therefore a more stable environment.
Nigel, in terms of going back to 2000, where you left last, besides the changing of the nature of volume tourism to more lower volume, what happened in terms of innovation in the tourism product business approach, as well as fair pay and fair trade?
Well, the biggest change really since I got involved in the industry, and I used to run camps in the Masai Mara, in the 80s. And what has changed everything is the massive population growth, and this is really what's changed our entire industry. I mean, Kenya's population in the early 80s was 18.6 million. It's 45 million now. And
Wow.
this is a massive change, and that means a lot of mouths to feed. And so what our aim and what we try to do now is to see that the population explosion doesn't affect tourism, because there's going to be a huge pressure on the game reserves because of the amount of land that's available. So tourism in South Africa feeds 1 in 7 Ma's in South Africa. It's a huge provider. So what we have to do within the industry now is to see that we can sustain that. And we've built an industry over the last 10 years, which is changing massively in the way it's structured, and the internet's changed the traditional supply chain. And the traditional supply chain was the client then went to the travel agent, who went to the tour operator, who then went to the ground operator out here in Africa, who then went to the accommodation supplier. Now, that's all changed now. It's all been very confused and blurred by the internet because people go direct and things. So we have to work that out and see how that's going to work now in the future. And we have to see that we can sustain the models that are gradually evolving. And we saw last year that we haven't actually done that very well, because we had this scare of Ebola, which was the disease that never touched sub-Saharan Africa. Not one person died of Ebola in sub-Saharan Africa, not one. And yet the industry in parts of Africa was down up to 70%. I mean, Kenya was 70% down last year, and the rest of the industry about 40% down. And why was that? That was because we as an industry have not got together as one and spoken with one voice. And the media, I'm afraid, Charles, to say that the media have been a problem for us, because the media outside Africa like to paint this picture of darkest Africa, Jungle Book type scene. They love that image, and that is one we've got to get away from. We've got to say that Africa was always open to business. There was never a problem down here, and we shouldn't allow the media with the rolling images on CNN or whatever, to destroy the industry that we're carefully building up, because there's so many people reliant, as Fiona just said, on living. So if you think of on the tourism, so if you think of like a hotel, with 10 beds or whatever, and they employ 100 people, it's not just the people in that hotel who are feeding our tourism, it's the person that provides the eggs, the laundry, so there's a huge amount of people involved in our industry, and we have to see that that's sustainable.
To be fair to CNN, I've noticed for the past 2 years or so, Focus on Africa, what is it called? They have a series every week.
We do Focus on Africa.
Great, right? And all aspects of African community, less so on tourism. And I think that kind of education information brings it more, brings it to the world as a up-and-coming community, evolving market economically, alongside tourism. But Nigel, what's the website address for African Travel and Tourism Association?
It's www.atta.travel.
And what would a traveler, is this primarily for the travel trade, or would the traveler also learn?
We're not really consumer facing, but I mean our membership is comprised, as I said earlier, so we've got a lot of tour operators and members who just go on the website and you can see where the tour operators are, and those are the people who should be arranging your safari or your experience in Africa, whatever it may be.
Okay, so very helpful there. Fiona, thank you very much. And what's the latest projects for Just a Drop in Africa?
We have projects currently going on in Uganda, Zambia and Kenya. We've got about 30 projects going on in Africa currently, but we've also got projects going on in Asia and South America.
And the website address for Just a Drop?
www.justadrop.org.
Thank you to both of you so much.
Thank you.